This is a letter which documents all the events that took place between certain members of my family and me, during our litigation of the Tierra trademark, according to my recollection, which took 4 years out of our lives. These are all facts. Nothing has been altered or omitted. If there are any small details missing, it is not intentional. It is a horror story that I would not wish on my worst enemy. But it is a story that must be told. On July 16, 2016, Tierra performed at Arceo Park in South El Monte for their summer concert series. There was a contractual agreement to hire Tierra, and bring in my brother Steve Salas in as a special guest artist to sing a few songs on the show. Before the gig, my other brother Richard Salas asked me if Steve could sell some CDs at our merchandise table. I said absolutely. Thinking it was one of Steve's solo projects, I said no problem. I found out later that the CDs they wanted to sell was titled, Steve Salas with Tierra. Steve was no longer a member of Tierra, and hadn't been for quite a few years. He and I had an agreement stating that he could not use the name Tierra in any of his projects, other than the moniker, Steve Salas, the original voice of Tierra, unless it was a project that him and I agreed to work on together. Steve had signed an agreement in 1987 that he was no longer a member of Tierra, and he was not entitled to any compensation other than a $4,000 severance pay, and royalties from a subsequent LP, which he received. He then pressured me to abide by a non-executed agreement that stated that I had sole use of the name Tierra on any performances, recordings, or live. In return, I paid him another $5,000 plus $200 for every Tierra gig, for doing absolutely nothing. Even though the agreement was non-executed, I loyally and faithfully complied, and committed to pay him this for 10 years up to that point. Plus he was getting 40% of all royalties from Tierra for recordings up till 1995, in which he was involved in. Steve was in a pretty good financial position, because the band was working a lot and he didn't have to lift a finger. The CD, Steve Salas with Tierra, which they released was filled with songs that I produced, and many that I wrote. I was not contacted prior to the release of this project, and they never asked for my permission or authorization in any way. The first 500 CDs didn't even give me any credit for producing the songs, or the songwriting. I later found out that Steve was using the name Tierra on some of his gigs, which was a complete breach of our understanding and agreement. I then became concerned, so I decided it was time for me to get some legal advice, which I felt uncomfortable with, being that Steve is my brother. But I asked a friend, who is in the legal profession, if he would help me out. He said he would do some investigating. He got back to me a couple of days later and said, "I've got some bad news for you. Your brother applied for the Tierra trademark behind your back. He declared under oath that he was the sole owner of the mark. I have been the leader of the Tierra since the inception of the band in 1971, and subsequently became the common law trademark owner as the founder and leader of the band. During all that time I serviced, maintained, nurtured, managed and contracted all bookings. I did all the taxes for the band, signed all insurance releases, produced, and arranged all the music, etc., etc., which are all the very definition of what entitles someone to be a trademark owner. The USPTO declares that you don't have to register the trademark for it to be valid. But you must show proof that you performed the functions that I mentioned, which I did. I subsequently went after my brother's USPTO application, and filed what they call an opposition, and I won. I then applied for the trademark, just to be on the safe side. Then they filed an opposition, and we were in litigation. When we were in litigation, Steve's backers consisted of my son David Salas, his wife Daphne, my brothers Richard and Robert Salas, and Steve's girlfriend, Mary Alcantar. It was a perfect storm. Each one of them had their own reasons to go after me. Robert and Richard started their own record label, and they figured that Tierra would be a great addition to their new company. Daphne wanted to align her so-called singing career with Tierra, and of course, David backed her up religiously and ferociously, unfortunately, to the point of selling out his own father. Mary is Steve's heir, so of course she was very loyal to him. They all figured that they could use Steve as a tool to bring in Tierra for their own purposes, even though Steve was no longer a member of Tierra. It's funny, none of them ever cared much about Tierra before all this, when I was busting my tail trying to keep the band going strong. They were all hoodwinked into believing that Steve was a victim, and had been screwed over by me, which was far from the truth. I have been the leader of the band since the band's inception. Steve didn't want anything to do with the business. I have always treated my brother more than fair. Financially, he got more money than everybody else in the band, even though he gave me most of problems, which also got me in trouble with the rest of band members. They would ask me, "Why do you let your brother get away with so much?" Anytime I asked him to help me out with running the band, he would say, "It's your band. You take care of it." And I did. But there are consequences to that. You can't relinquish all your responsibilities, then come back years later and say, "Okay, I want to reclaim ownership." It just doesn't work that way. The family declared that the reason they went after the trademark was 1. It had lapsed so long unregistered that they were going to hold it for both of us. So why did they do it behind my back and never told me or put my name on the application? Why did Steve declare under oath that he was the sole owner of the trademark? They said that they were going to eventually share it with me. Being that I was the common law owner of the trademark, that's like somebody stealing your car, and then when you find out, they tell you that they were going to share it with you. It's absurd. 2. They said they wanted the leverage to negotiate a better agreement with me. Well, that's called strong-arming, and as far as I'm concerned, that's extortion in my book. In their letters and documents to me, they threatened that the family, like something out of The Godfather, would see to it that Steve would get equal share of the trademark, and that it would be a very public trial. Later that year, the same friend that helped me with my legal advice, a very reliable source, went to a concert in the city of Ontario. My brother, Steve, was performing there. As my friend went backstage to talk to some of the artists, 4 people, all of them, my family members, including my brother Steve, approached my friend and told him, "We're going to screw Rudy over because he screwed Steve over." None of them knew that this gentleman was helping me out. They told him that they would wait until a gig at a casino that Tierra booked in New Mexico to fuck him over. My friend said that he couldn't believe the venom and hate-filled words coming out of their mouths, especially since they were family members. Sure enough, the night before the casino gig in New Mexico, I was hit with a cease and desist order. It was sent from a lawyer representing Steve, my son David, and his wife Daphne. I was heartbroken and livid at the same time. What made it so much worse was that they also sent one to my wife, and of course to the casino, my employer. I had to sign a release in order for them to allow us to perform that night. A week later, they sent the cease and desist orders to a couple of other promoters that I work with, threatening them not to hire me. My own family members were trying to stop me from doing what I've been doing to make a living for almost 50 years. This was a living nightmare. Fortunately, I had a great relationship with both promoters, and they told me not to worry, they would completely ignore it. Since we were in litigation, I was advised legally to stop paying my brother, which is standard practice, since he breached his agreement with me. My brother and his crew threatened me again. They followed through with their threats and they released product under the name of Tierra, and performed live shows using the Tierra name and logo. That's when I realized that I could never allow Steve ownership of the name. He would use it to stop me from going forward on any project if he wanted to. During that time, the family decided to schedule a meeting to discuss how they could keep my wife Joanna from taking the Tierra fortune. If it wasn't so sad and pathetic, it would be hilarious. First of all, the reality is, there is no Tierra fortune. Second of all, Joanna and I had never even discussed anything about Tierra property. She assumed and trusted that I would do the right thing. My daughter, Rita, walked out of the meeting and had an anxiety attack when she found out what they were up to. My uncle Art and my cousin Joe wanted nothing to do with it when they found out what was going on. We all know who was spearheading this conspiracy. This all followed a sinister and evil pattern that coincides with their declaration at the Ontario show that they were going to screw Rudy over. 2 tumultuous years went by, as both parties filed numerous legal procedures back and forth during the trademark trials. During that time, my wife and I were attacked and blasted publicly on Facebook by those particular family members, especially my son David and his wife Daphne. They defamed my character publicly and threatened to expose me, whatever the hell that means. Things were said to me by my own son, publicly, that no father should ever have to hear. What was so agonizing was the fact that, up until a couple of years before, David and I had a great relationship. We were both working in my recording studios together, without any problems. At one point, he even called me his hero. Anyway, those following years became living nightmares for my wife and I was 67 years old then. And the stress of all this conflict, especially with my son, became too much for me, and sent me to the hospital in 2015, where the doctor told me I would have gone into a comatose state if I hadn't gone to the ER. I needed a blood transfusion and they immediately gave me 2 pints of blood. It has left an emotional scar on me and my wife. We finally worked out a settlement through mediation in small claims court on October 11, 2018 that overrode all other agreements. The settlement provision stated that I had the sole right to ownership of the name Tierra for live performances and recordings. In return, I would pay Steve what I paid him before, plus 40% of royalties for recordings up to 1995, which were recordings that he was involved in. We abided by the settlement for about a year and a half, and everything was working out. Even my relationship with my son David and my brother Steve had improved. My brother Steve became ill. We got very close again as brothers, and agreed to work on projects together. All was fine, until the matter of the trademark came up again. Everything went back to square one. I wanted to stay with the court order, but he once again wanted ownership of the trademark, which I could not give him, for obvious reasons. The threats and the attacks came back. I was accused of taking advantage of Steve's illness, which was a sick, disgusting accusation. But I could not allow him ownership of the trademark, knowing that they could stop or sabotage any projects that I do with Tierra, simply because they disapprove. They proved that before, when they threatened to release Tierra product and use the name Tierra at their gigs when they thought they had the trademark, simply because they applied for it, then followed through with their threats and put out their own product under the name of Tierra. That would have jeopardized all the hard work I've done with Tierra for almost 50 years. I had to stand my ground. And I don't regret it. Finally, we settled again. Although technically, I gave him a percentage of the trademark, the procedure does not allow Steve any authority to make any decisions on Tierra or Tierra projects, or make any legal changes. There is no doubt in my mind that Steve and I would have worked it out from day one, if that part of the family would not have gotten involved. They seem to forget that I am also part of the family. Yet, they treated my wife and I as outcasts and perpetrators. They tried to make it seem that they were doing something noble, but in reality, their evil doings hurt my brother in the long run, and left almost irreparable damage to the relationship between that part of the family and my wife and I. Ironically, even though Steve was a 69-year-old, completely able-bodied man, up until this year, I'm the one who has always taken care of my brother, ever since my parents left me that responsibility when we were kids, as we went on this musical journey, to the point where I started to feel that it was my calling. So I made an offer that went way beyond the call of duty on my part, to the point that people in my corner wondered why I gave up so much. But we worked it out. It took 4 precious years out of our lives. I'm 71 years old now. I don't have the energy to keep fighting. But I can finally move on from this nightmare. This is a chapter in my life that I can never forget, and will stay with me to my death. I just hope to God I can find the moral strength to forgive.